The mountains had been there longer than the town, longer than the roads, longer than anyone's reason for staying. They stood at the edge of every morning in Grover Falls, Vermont, blue and indifferent, the kind of permanence that makes a man feel both small and steadied. Below them, in the last hour before dawn, a warehouse breathed cold air. Inside, a man finished his shift the same way he always did. Quietly. Correctly. He signed the clipboard, hung up his vest, and walked toward the door. He didn't know it was the last time. He didn't know that somewhere in the building, behind a locked unit, a plan 14 months in the making was about to put his name on something he hadn't touched. He didn't know that an hour later, $42 from the bottom of everything, he would stop at a bus stop that hadn't served a bus in 5 years. And he didn't know who was sitting on that bench, waiting, not for a bus, for him. The heater in the break room had been broken for 3 weeks. Marcus Webb knew this the way he knew everything about Crestline Medical Supply, not because anyone told him, but because he'd been the one to file the maintenance request. Twice. The second time, he'd taped a handwritten note to the request form that said, simply, "Someone will get sick." The note came back to him unsigned, the request still pending. He stood at the sign-out clipboard and breathed. His exhale made a small cloud in front of his face, gone in a second, like it had never been there. The pen didn't work on the first try. He scribbled hard circles in the corner of the page until the ink gave up and came through. His knuckles were white from 12 hours of lifting. Not his knuckles exactly, the spaces between them. There was a difference, and he knew it. And knowing it meant he'd been doing this long enough, that his body had started making distinctions his brain hadn't caught up to yet. He had $42 in his wallet. This was Wednesday. Rent was due the 15th. He was doing the math, the quiet, habitual kind that a man does when the math never quite works out, but he does it anyway because stopping feels worse when he heard it. Webb. He didn't turn around, not right away, because he recognized the voice the way you recognize the sound of a dog that's bitten you before. Not fear, exactly. Something older than fear, something that lived below the shoulders and made the back of the neck go tight. Kenneth Briggs was standing in the doorway of the break room, with his arms crossed over his chest. 46 years old, hair thin and combed forward over a hairline that had surrendered years ago and simply hadn't been told. He had a way of taking up space in a room that made every room feel smaller than it was, not because he was large, but because he stood like a man who'd decided the room belonged to him before he'd even walked in. Pullman needs you. His office. Now. Marcus set the pen down on the clipboard. His hands had the specific ache that came from 12 hours of lifting, not pain, the spaces between. Pain. He turned around. "What's this about, Kenneth?" "He'll tell you." Marcus looked at him for a moment. 2 years and 7 months he'd worked under Kenneth Briggs. In that time he'd noticed that Briggs never used anyone's first name. He'd also noticed that Briggs kept a spare key to the temperature-controlled unit on a lanyard under his shirt, where nobody could see it, even though company protocol required that key to stay in the supervisor's lockbox at the end of every shift. Marcus had never mentioned it to anyone. He'd told himself it wasn't his business. Walking to George Pullman's office now, he thought maybe he should have made it his business. The walk from the break room to Pullman's office was roughly 400 feet. Past the loading dock where 2 guys from the night crew were finishing up a late shipment, both of them moving with the slow efficiency of men who had stopped racing the clock hours ago. Past the row of forklifts lined up against the far wall like sleeping animals. Past the bulletin board where someone had pinned a birthday card for a woman named Brenda, who Marcus was fairly certain hadn't worked at Crestline for at least 8 months. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a sound like a trapped insect. Everything smelled like cardboard and diesel and the faint industrial sweetness of the floor wax they used on Tuesdays. Pullman's door was open. That was never good. When George Pullman closed his door, it meant he was on the phone with his wife or eating a sandwich he didn't want anyone to see. When his door was open, it meant he wanted witnesses to who was walking in. Marcus understood this without being told, the way you understand certain things about a place after you've spent 2 years and 7 months in it. "Marcus, come in. Shut the door behind you." He did. He sat down in the chair across from the desk without being asked, because there was no point in being asked. Kenneth Briggs came in behind him and stationed himself against the wall with his arms still crossed. George Pullman was 54 years old, a broad man with a face that had once been handsome, and was now just honest. He had a photograph of his granddaughter on his desk, and a coffee mug that had a small chip in the handle that he'd been meaning to replace for as long as Marcus had known him. He was the kind of man who remembered what grade your kid was in and asked follow-up questions the next time he saw you. He was not looking at Marcus. That was the first real sign. Marcus. He was looking at the desk, at a spot on the surface of the desk that didn't have anything on it. There's been a situation with the Stanton Holloway shipment that went out Tuesday night. Marcus nodded. He remembered the shipment. 42 pallets of high-grade medical equipment, insulin pumps, surgical instruments, a pair of sealed crates he hadn't been cleared to know the contents of. He'd helped load 6 of the pallets himself. What about it? 11 crates didn't arrive. Marcus waited. Pullman was still studying the empty spot on his desk. Didn't arrive where? Anywhere. They signed in here. They signed out of the dispatch log. The truck made it to the distribution hub in Rutland, but when it got there, 11 crates were not on the truck. Okay, Marcus said slowly. That's a lot of weight to lose between here and Rutland. That's what the insurance company keeps saying. And Marcus started to understand what kind of conversation this was. He could feel it, the specific texture of it, in the way Pullman wouldn't look at him. In the way Briggs was positioned against the wall like a man watching a movie he'd already seen and already knew how it ended. George. Pullman finally looked up. He had the eyes of a man who had been awake arguing with himself. There's footage from the dock camera. Tuesday night, 11:47. You were on that dock alone for approximately 6 minutes. I was closing up. I close up every Tuesday, I know. That's my job. I was doing my job. I know, Marcus. Then what is the problem? The problem, Kenneth Briggs said from against the wall, was that the paperwork showed Marcus had signed the last 4 crates onto the truck at 11:51. 4 minutes after the camera captured what it captured. And what the camera captured, Briggs said, was Marcus moving crates. Off camera some of the time. Marcus turned in his chair to look at him. Briggs had the kind of face that could be very expressive when it wanted to be. Right now it wasn't expressing anything. That was the most expressive thing about it. Kenneth, you were here Tuesday night. I saw your truck in the lot when I... You're mistaken. The word landed in the room like something thrown hard. Marcus felt his face go hot, not from anger, from something colder than anger, from the specific recognition of a thing being done to him deliberately, carefully, by someone who had planned it. He turned back to Pullman. George, I did not move those crates. I know you didn't, Marcus. Then why are we having this conversation? Because it isn't up to me. Pullman pushed a piece of paper across the desk. It was a termination notice, already signed by someone in HR whose name Marcus didn't recognize. Reason for termination, pending investigation, loss of corporate property probable, cause. The insurance company was driving it, Pullman said, and corporate. They needed someone off the payroll while the investigation ran. If it cleared, there might be a path back. Might. If. Marcus looked at him. George, I have a 19-year-old daughter in her first semester at UVM, and she is living at home because we cannot afford the dorms. I have rent due on the 15th. I have $42. I know, Marcus. I know all of it. I'm sorry. You're sorry I am. Marcus looked at the termination notice. His name was spelled correctly. His employee ID was correct. The date was correct. Everything about it was correct except for the reason it existed. He thought about Nora. He thought about the laptop with the broken hinge she'd been using since August. The one where she had to prop the screen against a textbook to keep it from folding shut during lectures. She hadn't mentioned it. He'd noticed anyway. He thought about the $42. He picked up the pen from Pullman's desk and signed the termination notice. At the door he stopped. One more time, Kenneth. Briggs looked at him from against the wall. Your lanyard's showing. Briggs's hand moved to his collar before he could stop it, a reflex, involuntary. The hand of a man who hadn't meant to confirm anything, and had just confirmed everything. His fingers found the thin cord under his shirt, the key tucked against his chest. The key that was supposed to be in the supervisor's lockbox. He looked at Marcus. Marcus looked back. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say. Marcus walked out. The parking lot was the kind of cold that didn't warn you first. It went straight through the Carhartt jacket, through the thermal layer underneath, and found the tiredness that had been sitting in his chest since about 3 a.m., and decided to make friends with it. He stood next to his truck without opening the door. The truck was a 2003 Ford Ranger with 214,000 miles on it. The driver's side door didn't latch properly. You had to lift the handle slightly while pulling. A specific motion. The kind you stop thinking about after a while. There was a crack in the windshield that ran from the bottom right corner up toward the middle, where it had stopped for now. He'd bought it from a man in bar for $1,200 3 years ago. It was the most expensive thing he owned. Second most expensive was Nora's mattress. He'd saved 4 months for it after her freshman orientation because she mentioned offhandedly that her old one was making her back hurt, and she had said it the way she said most things that cost money, which was once and quietly and never again. He had written it down so he wouldn't forget. He got in, he sat. The sun was coming up behind the green mountains, turning the whole sky the color of something that had been left out too long. The mountains looked farther away than they were. Most things did that morning. He thought about calling his brother. His brother was in Sacramento, and they talked 4, maybe 5 times a year. And the last call had ended with his brother saying, "If you ever need anything, Mark," and Marcus saying, "I know," and both of them meaning it, and Marcus not going to call him. He thought about calling Carol Whitfield. Carol lived 11 minutes away in a small house that smelled like cinnamon and old wood, and she had offered more than once, more than twice to help. He had never taken her up on it, because Carol lived on a fixed income and a teacher's pension and whatever Diane had left, which wasn't much, and because Marcus was not going to be the man who went to his dead wife's mother for money. That wasn't a line he was willing to cross even now. He thought about Diane, about the fact that she'd been gone 5 years and 3 months, and he still sometimes reached for the right side of the bed in that half-second before he remembered. He turned the key. The truck coughed once, then caught. He let it warm up before putting it in gear. He drove home the long way, through the center of Grover Falls, past the hardware store and the diner, and the small public library where Nora had spent every Saturday of her childhood, past the church with the hand-painted sign out front that had been misspelling the same Bible verse for at least 2 years, and had apparently committed to it. He was on Maple, heading for Birch, when he saw her. The bus stop at the corner of Chestnut and Vine wasn't a real bus stop anymore. The route had been cut in 2019 when the town redid its transportation budget. The sign was still there. The bench was still there. The small plastic shelter with the cracked roof panel was still there. But no bus came, and Marcus sometimes forgot that, and remembered, and thought it was a particular kind of sad the way a thing could remain standing, long after it had stopped meaning anything to anyone. The woman was sitting on the bench. She looked around 30, taller than average, even seated, a wool coat the color of charcoal, the good kind of wool, the kind that cost more than his heating bill. Dark brown hair that had started the night in some neat arrangement, and had gradually abandoned the plan pulled back loosely now, strands loose at her temples. A small black suitcase beside her, the kind with recessed wheels and a low profile, the kind that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd thought very hard about airports. She was looking at her phone with the specific expression of someone who was not looking at her phone so much as using it as a place to put her eyes while she figured out what to do next. Marcus drove past. Then he slowed. "Come on, Marcus. Just go home." He pulled over half a block past the intersection, sat there for a moment, turned around at the next light and came back. He pulled up in front of the bus stop and rolled down the passenger window. "Excuse me." She looked up, gray-green eyes, very tired, not the tired of a bad night's sleep, the tired of someone who had been holding something together carefully for a while and was starting to feel the seams. "This bus doesn't run anymore. Whatever you're waiting for, it's not coming." She blinked at him, then looked down the street both ways, in the way of someone recalibrating. "I wasn't waiting for a bus. I was waiting for a rideshare. It's canceled twice. Out here at this hour you'll be waiting a while. There aren't many drivers in this part of town before 8. "Yes." She looked back at her phone. "I'm discovering that. Where are you trying to get to?" A small pause. "Burlington." "That's a drive." "I'm aware. Your car?" "Broke down on I-91 last night. I got a tow to the nearest exit and walked the rest of the way into town. Every motel was full." She looked up from the phone and directly at him for the first time. "I'm not usually like this." "Nobody is," Marcus said, "until they are." Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile. Something that would have been a smile if she'd had a little more left in her. "There's a diner on Main 3 blocks that way. Opens at 6. It's warm. I can drop you off." She looked at him. She looked at the truck. She looked at him again, and he could see her doing the math man she didn't know. 7 in the morning, cracked windshield, coffee-stained jacket, and he understood completely why she was doing it. "I can call you a cab instead," he said. "From my phone. I'll pay for it. That might be smarter." She tilted her head. "Why would you do that? Pay for a cab for someone you don't know?" Marcus thought about it, not because he needed to think about it, because it deserved a real answer, not the first answer. "My wife used to say the world runs on small things people do for each other without keeping score." I don't know if she was right, but I figure I'm not going to find out by not doing them. A beat of quiet. "Your wife sounds like she thought about things." She did. She heard the past tense. She didn't push on it. He was grateful for that in a way that was disproportionate to the moment. "I'll take the diner," she said. "If you don't mind." "I don't mind." She stood. She picked up the suitcase, and it was heavier than it looked, and she had to set it down once before she got it up into the truck bed. She waved him off when he got out to help. "I've got it." She climbed into the passenger seat. The cab felt smaller with someone else in it. She smelled very faintly of expensive perfume worn many hours past its intended duration. Marcus couldn't remember the last time anyone besides Nora had sat in that seat. He pulled out onto Chestnut and they drove in silence for most of half a block. "What's your name?" She was looking out the window at the storefronts, just beginning to catch the early light. "Marcus? Elizabeth." She glanced at him. "Just Elizabeth, for now." "Okay, just Elizabeth, another half block? Then can I ask you something, Marcus?" "Sure. You look like a man who's had a very bad morning." He laughed. It came out shorter than he meant it to, more compressed. "That obvious?" "Your hands on the wheel." He looked down. They were tight. He made himself release them. "I got fired this morning, about 45 minutes ago. I'm sorry." "Yeah, can I ask why?" "They think I stole something I didn't steal." She was quiet for a moment. "Then why didn't you steal it?" He glanced at her. She was serious. "What? Why didn't you?" "If you had access, and you look like someone who needs money, why didn't you take it?" He thought about it. Not defensively, actually thought about it. "Because my daughter is watching, even when she's not there." He paused. "She's 19, first semester of college. Someday she's going to have to do something hard. And I want her to be able to do it because she watched me do hard things first. That's all I've got to give her, really. That, and some furniture." Elizabeth said nothing for a moment. She looked out the window. Then she looked at her hands. They pulled into the parking lot of the diner. The sign in neon said Helen's, except the E had been out for so long that it now said H-Lens, which was either a name or a decision. Marcus put the truck in park. "Thank you," she said. Then she paused with her hand on the door. "Would it be strange if I asked you one more thing? I've had a strange morning. I'm acclimated. My wallet was in my car. The tow company has it. I only have cards, and the sign in the window says cash only before 9 a.m. She looked at him directly. "Could you? I only need about $10. I'll pay you back." He was already opening his wallet. He had the bills memorized before he looked at them. 2 20s.
2 1.
He took the 2 20s, held them out. She stared at them. "No, Marcus. I said 10. Take it, that's $40. You just told me you lost your job." "I did. You have a daughter." "I do, Marcus. Take it. Get breakfast. Get coffee. Figure out how to get back to wherever you need to be. $40 isn't going to save my situation today, but it might make yours a little less terrible for an hour. That's a trade I can live with." She took the money. Slowly, the way you take something you don't want to take, but don't know how to refuse without making it worse. "I will pay you back. Don't worry about it. I'm going to." "Okay." She got out, pulled the suitcase from the truck bed, stood in the parking lot holding it and the folded bills, looking at him through the open passenger window with an expression he couldn't fully read. Something in it was complicated. Something in it, he thought, might be the specific look of a person who had just seen something they hadn't expected to see Marcus. "Yeah, you have a good face." He had no idea what that meant. "I don't know what that means. Neither do I." A pause. "But you do." She walked into the diner. He waited until the door closed behind her. Then he drove the rest of the way home with $2 in his wallet, and the windows fogged slightly from the cold outside, meeting the warmth of the heater, which had finally decided to work. The apartment was on the second floor of a 3-story building on Birch Street, above a laundromat that gave the whole place a permanent faint smell of warm fabric. The stairs were narrow. The banister wobbled in the middle, had wobbled for 8 months, would continue to wobble until Marcus got around to it, which kept getting scheduled and then bumped by something more urgent. Nora was at the kitchen table. 19 years old, first semester freshman, University of Vermont, International Relations, which she had chosen, because she was the kind of person who wanted to understand how the world worked at a scale most people found abstract. Her dark hair was pulled back with whatever was closest, which today was a hair tie that had been on the kitchen counter for 3 weeks. She had a textbook open next to a bowl of cereal she was eating dry because they were out of milk. And she was not going to say anything about the milk because that was how Nora was. She would notice things and not mention them and then casually solve them herself later. She looked like Diane. Not completely, not always, but in certain lights and at certain angles. Marcus would catch it the set of her mouth, the way her attention landed on a problem like something settling rather than something landing. Diane had looked at things the same way. Like she already knew what they were and was just double-checking. Hey, she looked up from the textbook. You're home early. Yeah. He put his keys on the counter, took off the jacket, hung it on the back of the nearest chair. Did something happen? He sat down across from her at the kitchen table. A couple of things, yeah. Bad things? Some of them bad. She waited. Nora was extraordinarily good at waiting. She did not fill silences with noise or reassurance. She just made space, which was something she'd had to learn at an age that was too young to have to learn it, and which had become, over time, one of her best qualities, and one of the things that sometimes made Marcus look at her and feel something vast and unnameable settle in his chest. I lost my job this morning. She absorbed this, chewed a dry Cheerio. Okay, it's going to be okay. I'm going to find something else. But things might be tight for a little while. Tighter than they are. A little, yeah. She nodded. Set her spoon down. Babe, there's something else. He hadn't called her that in a while. It slipped out from somewhere. They think I took something. From the warehouse. I didn't, but they think I did. And that's why they let me go. The insurance company, Dad. She looked at him steadily. Did you do anything? No. Then it's going to be okay. She said it the way she said things she knew. Not hopeful, not reassuring. Certain. The way you're certain about things you've already checked and don't need to check again. He didn't know what to do with that level of faith. He had no idea what he'd done to earn it. He wasn't sure he had. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Her hand was cold from the bowl. Dad, a pause. You look really tired. I am really tired. Go sleep. I'll be here. He went to sleep. He slept for 4 hours, which was 2 more than he'd expected. When he woke up, the apartment smelled faintly of toasted bread, and there was a glass of water on the nightstand that hadn't been there when he'd lain down. The rest of the day was the day that follows those mornings. He filled out the online unemployment application 3 times before the form stopped timing out. He drove to the gas station on the corner and put $4 of gas in the truck from the jar of change he kept on top of the refrigerator. He ate the end pieces of a loaf of bread and called it lunch and didn't mention to Nora that there wasn't much else. He sat on the couch for a while and looked at the wall and made a mental list of what needed to happen next. And the list was longer than the money available to address it, which was a math problem without a clean solution. At 3:30 he walked Nora to the library. She had a study group. She told him not to worry about picking her up, she'd get a ride. He told her to text him when she was leaving. She told him she always did. He said he knew. She said then why did he say it? He said because he was her father. She said that wasn't a reason. He said it was the only reason he needed. She walked away laughing. He stood on the sidewalk and watched her go until she turned the corner, and then he turned around and walked home with his hands in his pockets. The afternoon light was doing what it does in October in Vermont, going from pale yellow to pale gold to a kind of bronze that settled over the rooftops like a held breath before the dark came in. He stood at the window in the living room for a while and looked at the laundromat sign across the street and didn't think about anything in particular and thought about everything. His phone rang at 4:47. Unknown number, Vermont area code. He let it go to voicemail. He sat down on the couch. 4:52, same number. He let it go to voicemail again. 4:58. The same number called a third time. He picked up. He sat up straight because he knew that voice. Not well, not in any way he could justify or explain, but something in the shape of it, the cadence of it. The particular quality of how it held itself was familiar in the specific way that a voice can be familiar after a single hour. Speaking. This is Elizabeth from this morning. You dropped me at the diner. Yeah. He stood up without deciding to stand up. Yeah, I know. I'd like to pay you back. The $40? You really don't have to. I'd like to. A pause, different from the pauses he'd heard from her in the truck. This one was deliberate, like she was choosing something. Would you be home tomorrow morning? Around 9? I'll be home most mornings for the foreseeable future. 9 o'clock then. Can I come by? He hesitated. He was not a person who hesitated often. You got this number from somewhere. I didn't give it to you. No, you didn't. So how did you get it? I have ways. That isn't an answer, I know. I'll explain tomorrow. 9 o'clock? He walked to the window, pulled the curtain back slightly with 2 fingers. Phoned Birch in the early evening. A man across the street carrying groceries. A car going too fast for the speed limit. The old guy who walked his small brown dog every evening around this time. Already turning the far corner. Normal things. All of them normal. 9 o'clock, he said. Thank you, Marcus. Elizabeth. He stopped. Yes? Who are you? A long pause, longer than the others. The kind of pause that wasn't uncertainty but calculation, the pause of a person choosing exactly how much to say. Someone who owes you a debt, she said finally. I'll see you in the morning. She hung up. Marcus stood at the window for a long time after that. He stood there as the bronze faded out of the sky, and the streetlights came on one by one down Birch Street, and he thought about Briggs's hand going to his collar, and he thought about Pullman's eyes, and he thought about a woman at a bus stop who smelled like expensive perfume, and said he had a good face, and apparently knew his phone number. He didn't sleep well. That was not unusual. Sleep since Diane had been more like intermission than rest, a long dark pause between acts, where you sat in the quiet and waited for whatever was next. But this night was worse than usual. He lay on his back in the bedroom, the smaller of the two, the one he'd given up to Nora 2 years ago, when she needed a real desk, and stared at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like the state of Montana, or a dog, or, if he'd been awake long enough, the face of someone he'd rather not think about. Around 2 in the morning he gave up and went to the kitchen, made tea with a bag he'd already used once, stood at the window and looked at the building across the alley, which was mostly dark except for one window on the 3rd floor where a woman he'd never spoken to stood at her own counter with the blue light of a phone on her face. They didn't wave, they had never acknowledged each other. He found himself oddly grateful she was awake. He thought about the $40, he thought about giving it away, about the specific moment, the moment between knowing what you should do and talking yourself out of it for sensible reasons, where he had simply not listened to the sensible reasons. He wasn't sure why. He'd told her what Diane said about the world running on untracked kindness, and that was true. Diane had said that, but that wasn't the whole reason. The whole reason was smaller and harder to say. Something about not wanting to be the version of himself who drove past. At 7:14 he woke Nora, who had fallen asleep on the couch with a highlighter still uncapped in her hand. He made toast with the last of the peanut butter. He asked her what time she needed to be at class. She said 10. He said okay. She said she could stay home if he needed her. He said go to class. She said she didn't have to. He said, Nora, go to class, I'm fine. She looked at him for a moment with her mother's eyes in her mother's particular way of looking, and then she picked up her bag and went. He walked her to the corner where Carol Whitfield met her every morning she was home. Carol was 62, small, with a face that had once been beautiful in an uncomplicated way, and was now interesting in a more complicated one. She wore a red coat that was too light for the weather, and a scarf that Diane had knitted her the winter before she got sick. Diane had knitted a lot of things that winter. Carol still wore all of them. Marcus had never asked her about that. Some things you didn't ask. She saw Nora from half a block away and opened her arms without a word. Nora ran the last 20 feet like she was 7, not 19. Some things don't change with age, and the run towards someone who loves you is one of them. Marcus. Carol looked at him over Nora's head with the direct assessment of a woman who had spent 40 years as a middle school teacher and could read a person's situation in about 4 seconds. You look terrible. Good morning, Carol. Are you eating? I'm eating. That's not what your face is saying. My face is tired. Tired and hungry look different. Yours is both. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she let it go the way she let most things go, not forgetting them, just filing them where she could find them later. Nora, you have your ID? Yes, Carol. And yes, I wasn't finished. You were going to ask about my charger. I was going to ask about your student ID for the library, but now that you mention it.
Both of them, Carol.
I have both of them. Carol smiled. She tucked Nora's collar against the cold, with the efficiency of someone who has been doing that specific thing for decades and will do it until they cannot. Then she looked at Marcus and nodded once. Not a goodbye, an acknowledgement, like she was noting something in a ledger. He'd been on the receiving end of that nod since the day he'd shown up at her door 22 years old with Diane, who had said, "Mom, this is Marcus. He doesn't know it yet, but he's going to marry me." And Carol had looked at him for exactly 4 seconds and nodded in precisely the same way. He watched them walk down the street until they turned the corner. Carol didn't look back. Carol never looked back. Nora looked back once, waved, and was gone. He walked home slowly, watching his breath in front of him. The sidewalks were slick with frost that was more a memory than a fact, that not quite frost, that happens in early October when air can't make up its mind. Across the street, a man was trying to start a snowblower that had been sitting in a garage since March. It coughed. Quit. He swore at it in some language Marcus didn't catch and crouched down to look at it like looking would help. Marcus got back to the apartment at 8:22. He made his bed. He hadn't made it in a while, and he wasn't sure why he was making it now, except that someone was coming over, and the apartment was the apartment, and he couldn't change that, but he could do this. He wiped down the kitchen counter. He put away the 2 dishes in the drying rack. He stood in the middle of the living room and tried to see it like a stranger would the sag in the couch, the lamp from Goodwill, the bookshelf he'd built from pallet boards 3 years ago that listed slightly to the left and held more books than it probably should. He let himself feel the thing that came with that looking, the thing adjacent to shame, but not quite shame because the shelf held and the lamp worked, and the couch had seen all the things a couch sees in a family's life and had been present for all of them, and then he let it go. Because there was no version of the next hour in which this apartment became a different apartment, and there was no point in pretending otherwise. At 8:56 he heard the engines. Not loud. That was the thing, they weren't loud at all. They were quiet in the way that well-made things are quiet. The quiet of something engineered to do its job without announcing itself. He was rinsing his mug at the sink when he heard them. He turned off the water and stood still and listened. Then he walked to the front window and pulled the curtain aside. 4 black SUVs on Birch Street. They were parked in a staggered line, not quite parallel, the way vehicles park when the people inside them have thought about sight lines and exits. 3 of them had their doors opening. 5 men in dark suits stepping out. 1 man per exit point, not looking at anything in particular, looking at everything. Marcus stood at the window with the curtain in his hand. He was aware, in the small observing part of his brain that was still noting mundane things, that he had set his mug down on the radiator. He looked at it. He didn't remember doing that. The 4th SUV had its door still closed. 3 knocks on the outer door of the building, then footsteps on the stairs, then 3 knocks on his door, specific, deliberate. Marcus walked to the door. He stood there with his hand on the knob. He was 32 years old. He had $42 and a cracked windshield and a daughter who made sure. There was a glass of water on his nightstand when he was too tired to think of it himself. He had a termination notice on the kitchen counter with his name spelled correctly on it. He had a lanyard detail nobody had believed him about yet. He had the specific feeling that the moment he opened this door, his life would change in a direction he couldn't fully predict. He opened the door. The man on the other side was in his 50s, clean-shaven, with the build of someone who had once played a sport competitively and had not entirely let go of the discipline it required. He had a Bluetooth earpiece. His face was professionally neutral. "Mr. Webb?" "Yes, my name is Thomas Greer.
I work for Miss Hart."
"She's in the vehicle. She's asking if you'd be willing to come down and speak with her." Marcus looked past him. The hallway was empty. Through the stairwell window, he could see the roof of one of the SUVs. "She doesn't want to come up?" "She didn't say that, sir," she said to ask. "Miss Hartley." Marcus said it slowly, like he was testing the shape of it. "That's her last name." "Yes, sir. Elizabeth Hartley." He had heard that name before. He couldn't place it exactly, like hearing a word you know and not being able to locate where you learned it. "Give me a minute, of course." He went to the bedroom mirror. He ran a hand through his hair. Put on the blue flannel that had belonged to Diane's father, which was a size too big and which he'd been wearing on difficult days for the better part of 5 years without quite deciding to make that a habit. Looked at himself. He needed a haircut, had needed one for 2 months, didn't have it. He went downstairs. They walked him to the 4th SUV. Thomas opened the rear door with the specific care of someone who has done this many times, without making it seem ceremonial. Elizabeth Hartley was inside, different coat than yesterday, longer charcoal, a cream-colored turtleneck beneath it, hair down and brushed and falling on her shoulders in a way that had been attended to. Her eyes were the same, the precise gray-green of them, still tired, but differently the tired of someone who had not slept but had been productive in the dark hours, who had used the night for something. The door closed behind Marcus. It sealed with the sound of a much heavier thing than it appeared to be. Marcus, her voice was even, composed. The voice of someone in the habit of composing herself before speaking. Please sit. He sat. Between the two rear seats there was a small console, and on it a steel thermos and 2 paper cups. She was already pouring. I hope you take it black. I take it however it comes. She handed him the cup. Her fingers were cold. He looked at her across the small distance of the back seat of a vehicle that was very obviously not a regular vehicle. Outside the tinted window, Birch Street went about its morning. A woman walking a dog, a delivery truck turning the corner. You lied to me yesterday, he said. I didn't lie. You said your name was just Elizabeth. I said that was my name for now, which was true. I didn't give you my full name. That's different from lying. Most people would call that the same thing. Most people are imprecise. She held the coffee cup in both hands. I'm sorry, Marcus. That was a lawyer's answer. You deserved a better one. He looked at her. She looked back. There was something at the corner of her mouth, not quite an apology, not quite amusement, something between the two. All right, he said. Who are you? She told him. Her name was Elizabeth Hartley. She ran Hartley Freight International. Operations across 41 states. Partnerships extending into Canada through domestic subsidiaries. 18,000 employees. A company her father had built from a single regional trucking contract in 1987, and which she had inherited at 24 when he died of a heart attack in his office on a Tuesday morning, still holding the coffee he'd been drinking when it happened. And one of her company's subsidiaries was Crestline Medical Supply. Marcus sat with the coffee in his hand and let that land, because it was a lot to land, all at once. In the back of an armored SUV on Birch Street at 9 in the morning while the laundromat below his apartment ran its first cycle of the day. Your company owns the company that fired me. My company owns the company that fired you. Those are technically different statements. On paper, yes, on paper. She met his eyes without flinching, but not in any way that matters practically. You're right to say it the way you said it. He looked at her for a long moment. She was composed in the way of someone who had been in difficult conversations before, and had learned to keep her hands still during them. Her coffee cup sat on the console. She hadn't touched it since she'd poured it. You knew, he said, when you called me last night. You already knew who I was. I knew by late afternoon. I went back to the hotel and cross-referenced the morning's termination at Crestline against the employment records I had access to. Your name, your file, your shift record, everything. So when you asked if you could come over, you already knew what you were walking into. I knew what I was coming to say, yes. He looked out the tinted window. A woman was pushing a stroller down the opposite sidewalk, fighting slightly against the wind. Normal things, all of them continuing at their normal pace, indifferent to whatever was happening in this vehicle. The bus stop, he said. That wasn't an accident. No, there was no car breakdown. No rideshare cancellations. There were, actually. I ordered 2 because it creates a record of waiting and records matter. A pause. But I wasn't stranded. I chose that spot. He turned back to her. Why? This was where, she told him. Not everything, not yet. But enough. For 5 months, Elizabeth Hartley had been doing something her security team considered borderline insubordinable, and her legal team had been made deliberately unaware of. She dressed down. She went to towns where her company operated. She sat in places where workers passed through, diners near shift changes, parking lots at the end of late runs, bus stops, half a mile from loading docks. She watched. She listened. She bought coffee from people who didn't know who she was and asked how things were going, and she listened to the specific quality of how they answered. 3 years ago, she told him, she had been attacked at one of her company's facilities in western Pennsylvania. Not a stranger, someone who knew which entrance she used, which route she took from the parking structure to the main floor. Someone inside had told someone outside. She had never found out who. She had been unhurt, technically, though technically was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Since then, she had not done site visits with advance notice, because advance notice was how people arranged things. Thomas Greer had nearly quit over it. They had reached a compromise. He maintained a perimeter she couldn't see. At a distance she'd approved, and in exchange she could go in without a convoy. It was the kind of compromise that satisfied neither party, which was usually how good compromises worked. The stop on Chestnut and Vine is a quarter-mile from Crestline's rear gate, she said. I'd been watching that facility for 6 weeks. Because something's wrong. Because something is wrong. Yes, the missing shipments. She looked at him directly, not confirming, not denying, waiting. The variances, he said. Slower. That's what this is about. She reached to the seat beside her and opened a folder he hadn't noticed until she moved. She took out a single sheet and held it across the console. He took it. A table. Dates down the left column. Shipment IDs. Manifest weights. Weigh station weights from the first checkpoint on I-89. And a column on the right that showed the difference between them. Marcus looked at it. He looked at it the way he looked at things that were almost patterns, the feeling of a shape before you could name it, like a word you knew in a language you hadn't spoken in years. Most of these variances are small, he said. Under 30 pounds, normal packing drift. Keep reading. He kept reading. There and there and there again. Numbers that broke from the small range and went somewhere else. Not randomly. He looked at the dates. 4 seconds, maybe 5. They're all Tuesday nights. Yes, between 10 p.m. and midnight. Yes, he set the sheet down on the console between them. His hands were not entirely steady. Not shaking, exactly. The fine kind of vibration you get when a thing you suspected but couldn't prove stops being a suspicion. When the dock supervisor closes out the shift, he said. She didn't say Kenneth Briggs. She didn't have to. She just waited. How long have you known? My compliance team has been building documentation for 3 months. We know most of what happened. We don't know all of it. Specifically, we don't know who above Briggs in the organizational structure authorized the operation. We believe it isn't one person. We believe it's at least 3. Who's above Briggs? That's part of what I'm asking you to help us determine. Marcus leaned back in the seat. The leather was good leather, the kind that gave slightly under pressure and held the temperature of the room. He was aware of being in a very expensive vehicle discussing the framework of something that had, until 45 minutes ago, he'd believed, was simply a very bad morning. She explained the contract. 6 months with an extension option. The role was a real one, internal compliance field associate, on Hartley Freight's books, not Crestline's. The pay was $84,000 annualized. And there was the matter of the settlement, which her legal team had already moved on that morning. They had sent a formal demand letter to Hartley Freight's general counsel regarding the termination at Crestline, structured as a pre-litigation demand. Crestline would respond through internal channels. The settlement would be $60,000, paid as wrongful termination resolution, structured and documented and clean. $60,000, Marcus said, paid this week. Your bank would have it by Friday. He was quiet for a moment. That's not nothing, it's arithmetic. A wrongful termination suit against Crestline, fully litigated, would cost my legal team and theirs between 3 and 5 times that number, and take 2 years. The settlement is what the math produces when you subtract the litigation costs from both sides. It isn't generosity. Is everything arithmetic with you? She picked up her coffee cup for the first time. Most things. Which things aren't? A pause that wasn't hesitation. The pause of someone filing something away to answer later. I'll have to get back to you on that one. He signed the paperwork in a small conference room in a low brick building outside Montpelier that had no sign at the road and looked from the outside like a light industrial facility that had seen better years. Inside it was clean and fluorescent and populated by roughly 30 people who did not look up when Elizabeth Hartley walked through the main floor. Not because they were pretending, but because they had long ago established that looking up cost them 15 seconds, and she would find something for those 15 seconds to be used on. The NDA was 14 pages, the contract was 11. The settlement agreement had a check clipped to the top right corner, already printed, already made out to Marcus Webb, for $60,000. He stared at it for a moment. It'll clear by Friday, Laura Voss said, without looking up from the line she was indicating. Deposit it today. Don't carry it around. Laura was 45 tall, with the kind of presence that arrived slightly before she did. She wore her reading glasses on a chain of small gold links around her neck, which she removed and held in one hand when she wasn't reading, as if she needed something to do with them. She was the head of Hartley Freight's internal compliance team, and she was the person Marcus would be reporting to. He understood within about 3 minutes of meeting her that she had very little patience for uncertainty and a great deal of patience for the specific kind of work that required sitting in a bad chair, looking at numbers for 8 hours without complaining. He signed where she pointed. Then she walked him down a short hallway to a room with no windows and 3 monitors and a whiteboard on the far wall.
The whiteboard.
He stood in the doorway and looked at it. A chart in blue and black marker, dates, times, arrows, names connected to other names by lines that bent around each other like a diagram of something that had been growing in the dark for a long time. And in the bottom corner, inside a box, drawn with a slightly unsteady hand, his own name. Beside it, framed October 14. "This is where we work," Laura said. "You'll sit at that desk. I apologize for the chair. Procurement has been a problem." The chair was, in fact, a problem. Marcus discovered this within approximately 4 minutes of sitting in it. It listed to the right and had no lumbar support, and the height adjustment was locked at a position designed for someone 2 inches shorter than he was. He adjusted around it and didn't mention it because Laura had already moved on. She pulled up the dock camera footage on the center monitor. Tuesday night, 11:47 p.m. Marcus watched himself on screen, moving through the dock, closing the shift, doing the job he'd done every Tuesday for 2 years and 7 months. He watched it from the outside, and it was strange, the specific strangeness of seeing yourself in a moment you remember from the inside, where everything felt unremarkable, and then seeing it from outside where everything felt like evidence. At 11:49 and 6 seconds, something moved in the shadows behind the nearest forklift. A shape, not well defined. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then, as it slipped from the edge of the frame, the dock light caught something on the figure's chest, a thin horizontal line, a cord. "Play that again," Marcus said. She played it again. He leaned forward, a 3rd time. The cord caught the light. 1 second gone. Recognize anything? He watched the clip a 4th time. He didn't need to. He already knew. But he watched it again because something in him wanted to be certain before he said it out loud, because once he said it out loud it became a different kind of real. "Yeah," he said. "I recognize it." Laura looked at his face for a moment. Whatever she saw there satisfied her. She moved to the keyboard and opened the next file. The first week was numbers. Not the kind of numbers Marcus associated with investigation. No dramatic confrontations, no photographs taped to walls, no one standing in a hallway looking intense. Just data, weight variance logs, badge swipe records from every entrance and exit at Crestline, going back 18 months. GPS timestamps from the truck fleet, cross-referenced against dispatch logs. Temperature readings from the cold storage units, which fluctuated in ways that were small enough to look like calibration drift, and large enough to mean something if you knew what you were looking at. He had not known what he was looking at. By Thursday of the first week he was starting to. Laura gave him files the way a trainer gives a runner hill repeats, not because the hills were the point, but because they were building something. She would set a folder on the desk at 8:30 and say, "Before lunch." At 11:50 she would appear in the doorway of the windowless room with her hand out. If the analysis wasn't ready, she didn't say anything. She just stood there for 3 seconds and walked away. The next morning the folder was slightly thicker. He got home at 5 o'clock every afternoon. Elizabeth had been clear about that. A car came for him at 4:30. Paul Rourke, heavy set, bearded in a way that suggested a strong opinion about it, who did not make small talk and kept the radio off and drove with both hands on the wheel at all times. Marcus came to find this deeply restful. On the Friday of the first week, after the check had cleared, he stopped at the electronics store on his way home. Nora's laptop. New, actual new, not refurbished, not last year's model. The kind with a hinge that stayed where you put it. He set the box on the kitchen table. Nora came out of her room, saw it, and stopped. She walked toward it carefully. The way she walked toward things she wasn't sure were real. "Dad, I had a good week. This is..." She opened the box, lifted the laptop out with both hands, looked at it, looked at him. Her face did something she usually controlled better than this. "You didn't have to, I know." She set it on the table and opened it, and the screen came on, and she sat down in front of it and was quiet for a long time. Then, "Thank you." 2 words, quiet and certain, the kind that don't need anything added. He made dinner. She kept glancing over at the laptop while she ate. He pretended not to notice. It was one of the better evenings they'd had in a while. The second week was when he noticed the car. Gray Toyota Camry. Small dent in the front bumper, driver's side. He saw it in his rearview mirror on Monday morning, 2 cars back. He told himself it was coincidence. He saw it again Tuesday morning, same distance, same position. Wednesday evening it was parked across from the building on Birch, and he was fairly certain it had been there Tuesday night as well. He told himself he was reading into things. On Thursday he told Laura. She did not laugh. She did not suggest he was being paranoid. She picked up her desk phone, dialed an extension, and said, "Get me the plate on a gray Camry that followed Webben this morning." She hung up and looked at him. "You should have told me Monday. I thought I was making it up. Marcus." She took her reading glasses off the chain and held them, not putting them on. Just holding them the way she held things when she was about to say something she needed her hands free for. "You are not a paranoid man. Your problem is the opposite. You give people the benefit of the doubt past the point where it serves you. When you notice something, tell me. Even when you think it's nothing, especially then." 90 seconds later her phone rang. She listened, nodded once, hung up. The plate came back to a leasing company in Burlington. The leasing company rented vehicles to small businesses and sole proprietors. One of those sole proprietors was a private investigator named Gary Simmons, who was, by all available evidence, not a particularly sophisticated one. The kind you hired when you wanted to know something and didn't have the connections to find out another way. "Briggs," Marcus said. "I'm not saying that, is it Briggs?" A pause. "It's Briggs." Marcus sat with that for a moment. Kenneth Briggs, who had stood against the wall of George Pullman's office, with his arms crossed, and said, "You're mistaken," in the voice of a man who had already decided how the story ended. Kenneth Briggs, who was now spending money, his own money, apparently to keep eyes on a warehouse worker he'd successfully framed and sent home. Which meant Briggs didn't feel as safe as he'd looked. "What do? We let him watch." Laura set her glasses back on the chain. "He wants to see a man trying to put himself back together after losing a job. That's what you're going to show him. In the meantime, I'm going to have someone follow Gary Simmons and Gary Simmons' billing records. Because people like Simmons send invoices, and invoices leave trails, and trails eventually lead somewhere interesting. Thomas Greer put a man on Birch Street at night. Marcus would never see him. He asked once, in the first days, what the man looked like, and Thomas said that was the point. The whiteboard changed, not dramatically, incrementally, the way real things change. A new name here, a new line connecting 2 points that hadn't been connected before, a photograph added in the upper right corner that hadn't been there at the start of the week. Marcus started spending time in the room, even when Laura hadn't assigned him anything specific. He would come in early and stand in front of the board with his coffee and just look at it, the way you look at something you're trying to see from a different angle. The new photograph was of a man named Brian Stokes, Regional Operations Director, 54 years old, according to his company file, with a face that Marcus recognized and couldn't immediately place. Then he placed it, 2 years ago, a quarterly review visit to the Crestline facility. Stokes had walked the floor for 20 minutes, shaken hands with the supervisors, checked something on his phone, and left. He had not spoken to any of the floor workers. And the photograph after that added on a Wednesday afternoon, when Marcus came back from lunch to find Laura already in the room. Already writing was Richard Caldwell, COO, 58. Silver hair cut close, a square jaw, the upright posture of a man who had been athletic once and carried the habit of it even now that the activity had faded. Marcus had met him exactly twice, both times in the context of company-wide announcements that Caldwell delivered to a group of assembled employees, with the smooth confidence of a man who had given those speeches many times and believed them approximately half as much as he was paid to. He looked at the photograph for a long time. "Caldwell," he said, not a question. Laura was writing a new date at the top of a timeline on the right side of the board. "We believe Caldwell is the origin point. We believe Briggs runs the dock operation, Stokes manages the distribution side and keeps the regional numbers clean, and a woman in corporate accounts named Sandra Ames handles the financial movement." Ames. You wouldn't know her. She works out of the Burlington office. She's been with Crestline 12 years. She's good at her job, which is part of why this has worked as long as it has. He looked at the 4 photographs: Caldwell, Stokes, Ames, Briggs, and in the lower corner, his own name in its box. How much, he said. Laura wrote a number on the board, underlined it, stepped back. $11 million. 14 months. Marcus stood in front of that number for long enough that Laura, who rarely commented on silences, eventually said his name. I'm here, he said. I'm just processing. Take your time. He didn't actually take his time. He turned from the board and sat down and pulled up the file Laura had opened on his screen before she'd put the number up. Because the number wasn't the point exactly. The number was what it was. The point was the architecture, the specific deliberate construction of a system that had made the number possible. And what Laura had built on the board, and what Marcus was reading in the file, was a structure that had been designed from the beginning to be invisible. Caldwell had built it to be invisible, not crudely, not sloppily. With what Marcus reading could only think of as genuine care, the kind of care you put into a thing you intend to last. Inventory thresholds calibrated precisely to stay below automatic audit triggers. A routing structure that distributed small discrepancies across enough shipments that no single variance reached the level that would flag for review. And an internal reporting policy, one that Caldwell himself had written and proposed to the board 2 years ago, which had been adopted with almost no revisions, that made the process of flagging a shipping anomaly so procedurally difficult that most workers who noticed something simply didn't, because the form required 3 supervisor sign-offs, because the form went to a department whose contact information wasn't publicly listed, because the forms submitted generated an automatic notice to the regional operations director, which meant to Stokes, who had the authority to close the inquiry without further review. He weaponized the reporting process, Marcus said. Yes, he built the safety net with holes designed to catch specific people, which is how you ended up on the pavement instead of in a review board. Laura sat on the edge of the desk. She was quiet for a moment. The people who do this kind of theft don't think of themselves as thieves. They think they're underpaid. They think the company owes them something the company has declined to provide in an official capacity. They think they're clever. She paused. They're not clever. They're greedy and methodical, and they leave tracks they can't see because they don't believe anyone is looking carefully enough to find them. Richard Caldwell believes he has built something no one will find. He's been wrong about that for 3 months. He just doesn't know it yet. Marcus looked at the board, at Caldwell's photograph, at the number. Stokes' son, he said. He'd read the file in college. He doesn't know he's going to. Yes, that's not going to be a good day for him. Laura took her glasses off the chain and held them. Marcus, what happens to that boy happens whether you're here or not. Whether this case moves in 2 months or 6. The only thing your work changes is the timeline and the structure of what Caldwell's ex-wife's settlement looks like, which our attorneys can shape in a way that protects the tuition. If you walk away, the boy still loses his father. He just loses him without any of the protections that a careful legal process makes possible. He heard that. He looked at the photograph of Stokes on the board and then looked away. Keep working, Laura said. Not because it feels good, because it's the right thing to do in a situation where none of the choices feel clean. She stood up and left the room. At the door she stopped, which she rarely did. For what it's worth, the fact that it bothers you is exactly why she chose you. She didn't say who she was. She didn't need to. He didn't see Elizabeth for 10 days. He had expected her to be in the building more. He had expected to turn a corner and find her in a hallway, or see her in the main floor when he came in the mornings. She was not. Laura mentioned her twice, once in the context of a deadline, once in the context of a question Elizabeth had asked about his progress, and both times it was incidental, the way you mentioned the weather. He told himself this was fine. He was being paid to do a job. The job was the job. He was not being paid to wonder about the person who had hired him. He wondered about her anyway, not in a way he examined closely, just at the edges. The way she'd held her coffee cup in both hands. The way she'd said most things are arithmetic, and then, when he'd pushed, had declined to answer with the specific deflection of someone who knew exactly what the answer was and wasn't ready to say it. The way she'd said he had a good face at a bus stop on a cold morning, when he had $42 and a cracked windshield, and a termination notice in his pocket, and had said it not like a compliment but like a fact she was noting for her own records. On the Monday of the 3rd week she came to see him. He was alone in the room, just past 4. The office outside had the specific quieting of late afternoon. Keyboard slowing, chairs shifting, people reaching the end of what they had energy for. He'd been staring at a spreadsheet for 30 minutes without actually reading it. He was about to close the file when he heard the door. He assumed it was Laura. He didn't look up. "I'll have the AIM summary ready by morning." "That's good to hear." Not Laura's voice. He turned. Elizabeth was in the doorway, black sweater, dark jeans, boots that were not the boots of someone who spent her days in offices, the laces worn, the soles with actual miles on them. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was slightly flushed from the cold outside, which meant she'd been outside recently, which meant she hadn't come here directly from wherever she'd come from. "Miss Hartley, Elizabeth, please." She came into the room and stood behind him, looking at the whiteboard, while he saved the file and shut down the monitors. "You've added a great deal to that board. Laura did most of it. Laura's handwriting is a disaster. Half of that is yours." He looked at the board. She wasn't wrong. "Walk with me," she said. Outside, the parking lot lights were the orange sodium kind that turned everything slightly amber. The skies was a hard navy going purple at the edges. One star over the pine tree line, early and definite. There was a gravel path around the side of the building. She walked on it and he walked beside her. Not ahead, not behind. Beside. "How's Nora?" "Good. She got a laptop." "That's good." 30 feet of gravel quiet. "Elizabeth," he said it carefully. "You didn't come out here to ask about my daughter." "I did, actually. But not only that." She stopped walking. He stopped too. They were at the bend in the path where the pines thinned enough to see the hills beyond, going dark in that specific layered way that Vermont hills go dark in October, like they're being covered one color at a time. "Do you trust me?" He thought about it. Really thought about it, because she would know if he didn't. Not yet. Not fully. She nodded. "That's an honest answer. I don't have a dishonest one that would be useful, no." She looked out at the hills. "I need to ask you to do something I cannot run through Laura. Something that needs to come from you directly, not from the compliance structure." She paused. "I need you to go see Brian Stokes." He waited. "I need you to go see him and tell him you have information that could clear your name, and that you're willing to make it disappear for money. $60,000. Silence. "That's entrapment," Marcus said. "It's not. Entrapment requires a government agent inducing someone to commit a crime they wouldn't otherwise commit. I'm not the government, and Stokes has already committed the crime. We're creating a circumstance in which he can confirm it, on record. On record, you'd be wearing a wire." He looked at her. She was facing the hills, not him. "Elizabeth, I'm a warehouse worker. You're an observant man who has spent 2.5 years working in a warehouse. Those are different things. I have never done anything remotely like this in my life. I know. You don't have to do anything sophisticated. You have to go in nervous. You have to go in like a man who's been backed into a corner and is doing something he doesn't want to do." She finally looked at him. "That's not a difficult performance, because it will be the truth." He was quiet for a long time. The wind came through the pines. Somewhere across the hills, far off, a train was passing, and the low sound of it carried over the dark, in a way that was somehow both lonely and reassuring, the way train sounds at night always are. "Why me specifically?" "You have a compliance team, you have lawyers, because this will take months through the legal channel. Subpoenas, federal coordination, review boards, and in those months 2 more shipments will move. 2 more men will get framed the way you were framed. One of those men might have a daughter starting college. One might have a wife who is sick. I have waited long enough to wait more." She turned fully toward him. The path light barely reached them here. Her face was half in shadow. "I'm asking you. If you say no, we proceed through the courts. I won't hold it against you." He thought about his name in the lower corner of the whiteboard, the box around it, the arrow. What if it goes wrong? If it goes wrong legally, nothing happens to you. You've taken a meeting with a corporate director. You've made an ambiguous suggestion. You haven't executed anything. You haven't taken money. Legally, you're clean. A pause. If it goes wrong in another way, Stokes becomes hostile, feels threatened, Thomas's team will be positioned outside. You'll have a word. What word? You choose. Something you wouldn't naturally say in that room. He thought about it. The hills. The train sound fading now. Carol Whitfield, born and raised and still living in the city 60 miles north. "Burlington," he said. "Why Burlington?" "Because Carol Diane's mother, she was born there. I've never once had a reason to say Burlington in a sentence with people like Stokes. If I say it, it's a signal, not a sentence." Elizabeth looked at him for a moment. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite warmth, but was adjacent to it. The way certain colors are adjacent to other colors. If you say Burlington, Thomas comes through the door. Okay, you're agreeing, I'm agreeing, she exhaled. It was the first physical sign he'd seen that she had been holding something. Just that, the slow release of a breath. Then it was gone and she was composed again. Thank you, Marcus. Don't thank me yet. I'm thanking you for being willing, whatever happens after. They stood on the gravel path for a moment without moving. The pines, the dark hills, the space between them on the path that was the right distance for two people who hadn't decided yet what kind of distance was right. Elizabeth. Yes, why are you here? At this building, doing this yourself. He paused. You could run everything through Laura. You could sit in a boardroom in Burlington and receive reports. You could let this be someone else's project. Why isn't it? She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. My father owned this company before me, she said finally. He built it quickly. He did not ask too many questions about how quickly, or what was sacrificed to get there. When he died, I inherited a company with a reputation for getting results and a separate, quieter reputation for the way it got them. She paused. I spent the first years trying to clean it. I thought by the time I was 30 I would have done it. I turned 30 last year. The company is not clean. And the reason it is not clean is that every layer of leadership under me learned, over years, to tell me what I needed to hear. The same way they learned to tell my father. I cannot trust the dashboards. I cannot trust the briefings. The only thing I can trust is what I can see with my own eyes in places where no one knows I'm looking. So sit at bus stops. So I sit at bus stops, and sometimes I'm wrong about what I'm seeing, and sometimes I'm right. And sometimes a man with a cracked windshield pulls over and gives me the last $40 in his wallet. And I understand something about my company that no report would have told me. What did you understand? She looked at him. That there were still honest men in the field. And that I had stopped believing there were. He didn't know what to say to that. He looked at her and saw, for just a moment, the thing that was underneath the composure, a person who was tired in a very specific way. The tiredness of someone who had been carrying something alone for long enough that they could no longer clearly remember what it felt like not to be carrying it. He wanted to say something useful. He wasn't sure what it would be. Elizabeth, yes. After this is over. The whole thing, he looked at the hills. Will you stop sitting at bus stops for a while? She almost smiled, not quite, but almost. For a while she said, yes, I think I could manage that. Good, it's cold out here, it is. We should go in. Yeah. They walked back down the gravel path toward the building. The windows of the main floor were lit from inside, warm and yellow, spilling out onto the gravel. Thomas Greer was at the edge of the parking lot in his usual position, watching the road, which was empty. He nodded at them as they passed. He did not ask where they'd been. At the door she stopped. It'll be Thursday, she said. Stokes agreed to see you. He thinks you're coming to discuss an appeal of your termination. He thinks he's being generous. Thursday is 2 days. Laura will brief you tomorrow and Wednesday. You'll know what to do. He almost said something. He wasn't sure what. She held out her hand. He took it. She didn't shake it. She held it for a moment, a brief, deliberate pressure, and then let go. Be careful, she said. I will. She went inside. He stood on the gravel for a moment before following, looking up at the one star still visible over the pines. The train was long gone now. The hills were fully dark. He thought about Nora at the kitchen table in the lamplight, looking at the new laptop like it might not be real. He thought about his name in the corner of the whiteboard. He thought about Burlington, and what it meant that he had chosen it, and what it meant that it had been the first word that came to him. He went inside. Thursday morning arrived the way significant mornings do, not dramatically, just present, just there. Marcus woke at 5:43 without an alarm. He lay on his back for a moment looking at the water stain on the ceiling. Montana, or a dog, or a man with his head slightly bowed. He got up, he made eggs. He ate them standing at the counter and looked out the kitchen window at the building across the alley, which was lit in a few windows and dark in most. He drank his coffee. He thought about the things Delia had told him over 2 days of prep. Keep your hands visible. Let him lead. Say less than you think you need to say. The goal is to get him talking, not to impress him with what you know. He thought about the vest, which Scott Finley had fitted him for yesterday afternoon, and which Scott had smoothed against his chest with the careful patience of someone who had done this before and took it seriously. Has anyone you've done this for been shot? Marcus had asked. Scott had paused. had looked at him with a kind face under the red hair. Twice, both of them walked away. He'd stepped back and looked at the vest under Marcus's shirt and nodded. You'd never know it's there. Marcus had looked at himself in the small mirror, a man in a flannel shirt, which he was, mostly. He knocked on Nora's door at 7:15. She was already awake, already dressed, books spread across the desk he'd bought her. She had a lecture at 9. I've got a thing this morning, he said. Might be later than usual getting home. She looked up, studied him with the assessment that was her mother's, refined over 19 years into. Something more developed and more patient. Okay, Carol's around if you need anything. Dad, I'm 19, I know. I'm fine, I know. He paused at her doorway. Hey, Nora, yeah. He almost told her where he was going. Why? He almost walked into a room and sat down and explained the whole architecture of the thing, the dock camera, the lanyard, the woman at the bus stop, the whiteboard with his name in the corner box. He almost did it because he was her father and she was her mother's daughter, and she would have understood all of it and probably had questions that would improve his preparation. Instead, he said, "You know I love you." She looked at him. "Dad, yeah, I know. Go do your thing." He drove himself. That had been his request. And Laura had agreed, with the specific expression of someone agreeing to something they found professionally objectionable, but couldn't argue against on its merits. The Ford Ranger, with its 214,000 miles and its door that required the lift and pull, headed up the highway toward Burlington under a sky that was cold and perfectly clear. Thomas Greer was somewhere behind him in a vehicle Marcus couldn't identify. Scott Finley was in a van near Stokes's office building with headphones and a receiver. Paul Rourke was ahead of him by 3 miles, which seemed far and was apparently not. The wire itched. He had not expected it to itch. It was taped with a professional tape that was supposed to be skin neutral, and Scott had been careful, and still it itched. And Marcus drove 60 miles per hour up I-89, trying not to reach under his shirt and scratch it like an animal. The Crestline corporate office in Burlington was a 4-story building of glass and weathered brick, on a corner 2 blocks from the waterfront. The parking lot had a visitors section. He parked in it. He sat in the truck for 30 seconds with both hands on the wheel. The lobby smelled like climate-controlled air and whatever they used on the floors. The receptionist was young, on a call, and held up one finger without looking at him. He stood in front of her desk and felt the wire against his skin, and thought about nothing in particular, which was a technique he'd developed over 2.5 years of waiting for forklifts and shipments and sign-off from supervisors, the ability to simply be in a moment without accelerating it. "Mr. Stokes, your 10 o'clock is here." A pause, then to Marcus, 3rd floor. "He'll meet you at the elevator." The elevator was slow. He watched the numbers. He told himself what Laura had told him 7 times across 2 days. The goal is not to perform. Confidence. The goal is to let him see exactly what he expects to see. A man in a difficult position doing a difficult thing. That's all. The elevator opened. Brian Stokes was waiting. 54. Not tall. The kind of face that had learned to smile early and had been doing it professionally for 30 years. Which meant the smile arrived before the eyes and left after them. Navy blazer, white shirt, no tie. He extended a hand with the ease of a man for whom handshakes were a tool he'd sharpened. "Marcus, good to see you. Come on back." They walked down a hall with framed photographs, trucks, facilities, a board meeting shot in a conference room that Marcus looked at and looked away from because he had recognized someone in it who he was not supposed to be thinking about yet. Stokes's office was a corner room with windows on 2 sides, mountains in one direction, parking lot in the other, a big desk, 2 chairs in front of it. Marcus sat down. He let his hands rest on his knees where they were visible. He let his face be the face of a man who had rehearsed this conversation in his kitchen at 2 in the morning and was only now discovering that rehearsal and reality had a gap between them, because they did. The gap was real. His pulse was doing something he was aware of. He let it. "So, Marcus, how are you holding up?" The conversation that followed was the most carefully calibrated thing Marcus had done in his adult life. And he had once talked a forklift driver down from quitting in the middle of a shift during the largest overnight they'd run that year. He said less than he knew. He let silences go long enough that Stokes felt the pressure to fill them. He looked down at his hands twice, not because he was coached to, but because his hands were actually doing the thing hands do when a man is asking for money he doesn't want to ask for. He laid it out slowly. The variances, the way station tickets, the dates. the corporate paperwork with the same initials every time. He said he had it written down. He said he had a friend at a way station who'd sent him records he probably shouldn't have sent. He said he needed $60,000. He said he wanted to disappear. And Brian Stokes, who was not a stupid man, sat behind his large desk and did the calculation that greedy men do, the calculation where they weigh the risk of action against the risk of inaction and decide, based on a confidence in their own position that they have not yet earned, that they can manage this. 60,000 isn't something I can write a check for, Stokes said. I wasn't asking for a check. What were you asking for? I was asking for a man like you to figure out how to get $60,000 to a man like me in a way nobody sees. A small thing happened on Stokes's face, microscopic, the jaw. One muscle, one movement, and then gone. And you think I know how to do that? I think you've done something like it before. The pause after that was the longest one. Marcus kept his face, the face of a man who was ashamed of being here and was here anyway, which was not difficult, because it was true. He was ashamed of the performance. He was here anyway. Stokes leaned back in his chair, the shift of a man who had decided to relax because he had decided this was manageable. Somebody will be in touch within 72 hours. You'll meet them at a location they choose. You'll bring what you have, all of it, not copies. He paused. Are we clear on that? Yes. And Marcus. Stokes stood. He walked around the desk. He put his hand on Marcus's shoulder, the hand of a man taking the measure of something, checking its weight. I'm glad you came to me, instead of anyone else. That was the right call. Marcus nodded. He said what a man in his position would say. He walked to the elevator. He rode it down 3 floors. He walked across the lobby past the receptionist who was on a different call now. He pushed through the glass door into the cold, clear Burlington morning. He walked to the truck. He got in. He sat. Then, very quietly, barely above the sound of his own breathing, he said one word. Not for himself. For the man with the headphones 2 blocks away. Burlington. He started the engine. He pulled out of the visitor parking lot and onto the street and onto the highway. His hands were shaking, not badly, not visibly, but in the way hands shake when they have been required to do something that hands were not designed to do, and have done it anyway. Somewhere around the second rest stop, he started to laugh. Not because anything was funny. His body needed to put something down, and laughing was what came out, short and real. And when it finished, he sat in the strange quiet of the truck cab, and understood that it was over. Not the case. Not the work. But the part that required him to sit across a desk from a man who had helped ruin him and look at that man without letting his face do what his face wanted to do. That part was over. He wiped his eyes on his sleeve, which seemed like a reasonable thing to do. He kept driving south toward Montpelier. When he got back, Laura was at the door. Thomas was behind her. A young man with a tablet was behind Thomas. They walked him down the hallway without speaking, the 3 of them, and in the conference room at the end, Elizabeth was already seated at the table with a pair of headphones around her neck and a face he couldn't fully read. She stood up when he came in. She didn't smile. Sit down, she said. He sat. She sat across from him. You did it. I did it. You did it very well. It didn't feel very well. It felt like I was going to be sick the entire time. That, she said, is exactly what doing it well feels like. She reached across the table. She placed her hand over his for a moment briefly, the pressure of it just enough to be real, and then took it back. Now we finish, she said. The call came on a Saturday afternoon. Marcus was on the couch with a book he wasn't reading when his phone buzzed on the arm of the cushion beside him. Unknown number. Vermont area code. He looked at it for 1 second, then got up quietly and walked to the bedroom and closed the door. The woman's voice was flat and professional, the voice of someone reading from a mental script they had memorized well enough to sound natural. Tomorrow, 4 p.m. an unpaved turnoff on Route 12A, approximately 3 miles north of Northfield. Old logging road. Drive in exactly a quarter mile and stop. Leave the engine running. Don't get out of the vehicle. Bring the records, all of them. Don't bring anyone. If they saw another car on that road within 90 minutes of his arrival, the meeting was off and the mutual friend would be very unhappy with him. Then she hung up. Marcus stood in the bedroom with the phone in his hand. The window across from him looked out into the air shaft between buildings. Gray concrete. A drain pipe. A crack running diagonally across the facing wall that had been there since he'd moved in and had not grown since, which was the most reassuring thing about it. He went back to the living room. Nora was at the kitchen table with her textbooks spread open and a cup of tea going cold beside them. She had headphones around her neck but not in her ears, which was her way of being available without actively inviting interruption. "Work?" she said without looking up. "Yeah, on a Saturday. Sometimes on a Saturday." She looked up then, not with alarm, with assessment. She had her mother's capacity for looking at a thing and seeing more of it than was visible. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Dad. I'm fine, Nora. It's just a call I needed to take privately." She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked back at her book. "Okay." A pause. "Carol texted. She's making that soup you like if you want to come by tonight, maybe. I'll let her know." He called Laura from the kitchen. She picked up on the second ring, he told her. She was gone for about a minute. He could hear the background noise of a room with other people in it, keyboards, something being said in a low voice that had the cadence of an instruction. Then she was back. "Come in tonight. Can you bring Nora to Carol's? She's 19. She doesn't need." "Marcus, yeah, I can bring her," he did. Carol met him at the door in her slippers, assessed his face in 4 seconds the way she always did, and put her hand on his arm briefly, the gesture that was her version of saying all the things she wasn't going to say, and waved him off. The building outside Montpelier was fuller than he'd ever seen it on a weekend. 2 cars he didn't recognize in the lot. Marcus went to the main conference room and found it rearranged, the big table still centered, but maps laid out across it now, topographic prints and satellite images with timestamps. 4 people he hadn't met before, 2 women and 2 men, all of them in the casual clothes of people called in on a day off, all of them looking at him with the mild, professional curiosity of people assessing a variable. Laura was at the head of the table. Elizabeth was 2 seats down from her, leaning forward, both hands flat on the surface. Thomas Greer had driven to Route 12A that afternoon with 2 members of his team. He laid it out with the efficiency of someone who had already decided what the important information was and was not going to waste time on the rest. The logging road ran east off 12A into mixed pine and hardwood. It had been used for timber extraction years ago and was now half overgrown, with 1 usable vehicle lane and soft shoulders. A 1/4 mile in, the road opened into a clearing roughly 60 feet across where equipment had once been staged. 1 way in by vehicle, 1 footpath out the back side, up a ridge, emerging on a fire road a mile east. "This is a poor location for violence," Thomas said. "Too close to the highway. Sound carries. They picked it for privacy, not for what comes after." He set a photograph on the table printed that afternoon, the clearing visible through the trees, 2 tire tracks still fresh in the soft ground. "They are not professionals in the operative sense. They are people who have been stealing medical equipment for 14 months and have now convinced themselves they are also the kind of people who manage loose ends. They are not the vest," Scott Finley said from the far end of the table. "The vest is a backstop," Thomas said, "not the plan. The plan is, arrive at 4 p.m., stop 20 feet before the clearing, leave the engine running and the keys in. If they approach the truck, fine. If they want you to walk the last 20 feet, walk it. Do not go past the clearing perimeter. Do not get in any other vehicle. Do not follow them anywhere. If they attempt to move you, say the word and we come through. We'll be positioned in the tree line on 3 sides before you arrive," Thomas continued. "You will not see us. That is by design." "Caldwell," Elizabeth said. She hadn't spoken since Marcus came in. "What's the likelihood Caldwell has Briggs in the woods?" Thomas looked at her. "High. Define high. 70% or better. Briggs is the operational layer. If they're worried about the meeting going wrong, Briggs is the person they send. He'll want to see it for himself. So I might have Briggs 30 feet away from me while I'm doing this," Marcus said. "Possibly," Thomas said. "If he's in the tree line, we see him before he sees us. We follow him out after you leave and pick him up before dark. If he is there, you do not acknowledge him. You do not look for him. You complete the conversation, take the envelope, and drive out." Marcus looked at the photograph of the clearing. 60 feet of open space in the middle of Vermont pine forest. Soft ground and 1 way out. "There's one more thing," Laura said from the head of the table. "The envelope isn't the main event. The envelope is evidence and it matters, but it isn't the point. The point is what they say before they hand it to you." She looked at him directly. "We know about Stokes. We know about Briggs. We know about Sandra Ames. What we do not have on record is the person above Stokes in the structure. Elizabeth believes there is one. I am not fully convinced. What I know is that if you ask carefully, as a frightened man trying to understand how much danger he's in there, is a chance whoever shows up tomorrow will tell you something they have no reason to keep quiet about, because they will have already decided you are someone they can manage. They think I'm manageable, Marcus said. They think you're desperate. Which is different and which is what makes this possible. She paused. Don't push on it. Ask once. Let the silence do the rest. If they don't answer, you move on. Elizabeth stood up then. She came around the table. Owen is going to fit you for the vest now. Get some sleep tonight if you can. Be back here at noon tomorrow. Everyone else began collecting their things, the specific organized dispersal of people who had other tasks and knew how to transition between them. Marcus stood at the table, looking at the satellite image of the clearing, the shape of it, the tree line on 3 sides. Elizabeth stopped beside him. She didn't say anything immediately. She was kicking at the same photograph. If you want to stop this, he said, I mean it. You can, I know. Say the word, and we go through the courts. Marcus. She looked at him. I am not stopping it because you would be disappointed in yourself if I did, and I am not willing to be the reason for that. Stop offering me the exit. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in her face he was starting to recognize, the specific expression of a person who had made a decision they knew was right, and were now living with the weight of having made it. Come on, she said. Owen's waiting. The vest was thinner than he'd expected. Scott fitted it against his chest with the practiced care of someone who understood that the person wearing it was not a professional, and that the gap between a professional and an amateur, in this specific circumstance, was a gap that the vest might someday be asked to close. He smoothed the edges. He pulled Marcus's flannel down over it and stepped back and looked. You'd never know, Scott said. I know, Marcus said. I mean it. I know you mean it. Scott looked at him, honestly, directly, with a kind face that sat under the red hair. Has anyone I've wired been shot? Yeah, twice. Both of them walked away, Marcus. I need you to hear that not as reassurance but as a fact. The vest works. Your job is to make the vest unnecessary. Those are 2 different things and both of them are true. Marcus nodded. Don't reach under your shirt, Scott said. I know it itches. It really itches. Don't. I won't. He went back to the conference room. Most people had gone. Laura was at the table with a legal pad, writing quickly in the handwriting that Elizabeth had once called a disaster, and which Marcus had privately come to think of as energetic. Thomas had his arms crossed, looking at something on his phone. Elizabeth was at the window. She didn't turn around when he came in, but she knew he was there. There's one more thing, she said, still at the window. Something I haven't told Laura. Thomas looked up from his phone. He seemed to understand, from whatever signal people who work closely with each other develop over years, that this was the moment to find something else to look at. He looked at his phone again. My father, Elizabeth said. When I was 11, he cheated at a board game. Monopoly, my birthday. He was moving money from the bank when he thought I wasn't watching. I caught him. He laughed. He said, in business, everyone cheats and the only question is whether you get caught. She was quiet for a moment. I didn't argue with him, but I remember thinking very clearly that I did not want to become that. She turned from the window. I became it anyway, for a while. In my 20s after he died, there was a year where I was signing things I hadn't read, giving authority I hadn't earned to people I didn't know well enough. I gave Caldwell a great deal of latitude in that year. He learned that I would approve what he put in front of me. He made decisions in that year that shaped what he was capable of for the next 6. She paused. The system he built that allowed him to frame you, that system exists because I let it exist. I want you to know that I know that. Elizabeth, let me finish. Not sharp, just clear. What happened to you was partly my fault. Not in the way that makes me the villain of your story, but in the way that means I owe you an accounting that goes beyond the settlement check and the job offer. She looked at him steadily. I am telling you this because you deserve to have the full picture, and because I am not interested in being the person who makes things right in a way that leaves her own responsibility conveniently out of the frame. The room was quiet. Thomas was looking at his phone with the careful attention of a man who was absolutely not listening. You don't owe me that, Marcus said. I do. The accounting is already done, Elizabeth. It balanced out weeks ago. You can stop carrying it. She looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her face, not relief, exactly, but the thing adjacent to relief. The thing that comes when a weight you've been holding is acknowledged by someone who then simply takes it from you without ceremony. Go home, she said. Sleep, if you can. I'll see you at noon. He drove home in the dark, picked up Nora from Carol's, where Carol had, predictably, fed her the soup and also, apparently talked to her for 2 hours about a quilt she was making, which Nora had developed an inexplicable investment in. Nora talked about the quilt pattern the entire drive home with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered an unexpected interest and was still figuring out what to do with it. Marcus listened. He let it fill the car. He did not sleep much. Around 4 in the morning he got up and went to Nora's room. She was at Carol's. He'd have gone there otherwise, and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark. Her bookshelf. Her books, a worn copy of a novel she'd read twice, spine cracked at her favorite chapter. He sat there for a while without doing anything in particular. He made eggs at 6, ate them, made coffee. At noon, Paul Rourke knocked on his door. They drove to Montpelier. The GPS device had been attached to the Ranger before Marcus arrived. Someone had done it while he was getting coffee, discreetly, professionally. Paul would follow at 2 miles, invisible by design. Thomas's team was already en route to the tree line. Scott fitted the wire with the same careful attention as the night before. The vest went on under the flannel. Paul drove him to the Ranger, ran through the logistics once more. Keys in the ignition, engine running, phone visible in the cup holder. 440 yards to the quarter-mile mark. Stop and wait, and then stepped back. Theo Paul, Marcus said. He'd almost said the wrong name. Too much in his head. Paul looked at him. Thank you, for all of it, the driving. Paul Rourke was not a man who said much, but he nodded once the way men nod when something matters and words would only clutter it. Marcus drove I-89 north to the 12A exit, then north on 12A with the radio off and both hands on the wheel. The mountains on either side of the highway were past peak color, the reds mostly gone, the oranges fading, the trees settling into the brown and gray of late October. There was still beauty in it, the particular beauty of things after their brightest moment, which Vermont seemed to understand better than most places. He found the old wooden post at the roadside 3 miles north of Northfield. The sign was gone. Just the post and the rusted bracket where it had once hung. He turned onto the logging road, narrower than the satellite images had made it look. The trees closed in overhead. The light went green and low, filtered through pine boughs, and for a moment the world got very quiet in the way forests get quiet, not the absence of sound but the presence of a different kind of sound, the kind that reminds you that the world is very large and you are very specific inside it. He watched the odometer. At 440 yards the road bent slightly and the clearing opened up beyond it. He stopped 20 feet back, left the engine running, turned off the radio he hadn't had on. 2 vehicles in the clearing, a dark green pickup truck, a black sedan. 3 men standing near the pickup, not spread out, not positioned, just standing the way people stand when they have decided that standing casually is the right performance for this moment. None of them were Kenneth Briggs. None of them were anyone Marcus recognized. Which meant, and he understood this, without having to think through it, that Briggs was somewhere in the tree line at his back. The man in the brown canvas jacket detached himself from the group and came to the driver's window. Broad, calm. The voice of a man who had done something like this before. Not many times, but enough to have lost the nerves about it. Mr. Webb. That's right. You're on time. I was told to be. Step out of the vehicle. Just 10 steps. Leave the door open. Marcus got out. He left the door open. He walked 10 steps into the clearing and stopped. The man in the brown jacket went to the truck, leaned in through the passenger door, picked up the manila envelope on the seat, flipped through it, the sound of paper, methodical, unhurried. He came back. This is everything? Everything. No copies. No copies. The man looked at him. Not with suspicion exactly. With the assessment of someone running a final check on a transaction before signing off. Then he went back to the pickup and said something low to the second man, who straightened and pulled a thick white envelope from his jacket pocket and walked it over. Count it, the second man said. Marcus opened the envelope. $100 bills, bank-banded, 6 bands, $60,000. His hands were steadier than he had any right to expect. He rifled through 2 of the bands, enough to confirm the denomination, then put the envelope inside his jacket. That's it then, the first man said. He started to turn, and Marcus heard himself speak. Can I ask you something? The man turned back, not annoyed, just assessing the delay. How high does this go? I need to know. Not for anything, I need to know how far I have to run to feel safe. The man looked at him for a moment, then at the clearing around them, at the truck, at Marcus. Something in his posture shifted, not loosened but recalibrated. The shift of a man who has already been paid and is feeling the brief, uncomplicated generosity that comes after a transaction has concluded successfully. "You think Stokes is the top of this," he said. "I don't know." A sound that was almost a laugh. "Stokes is middle management. Stokes takes a number that's already been set and makes sure it gets paid. Stokes doesn't decide how many crates move in a month. That number comes from someone above him." He paused. The pause of a man choosing. "Then woman named Sandra Ames in the Burlington office handles the accounts. She's been doing it 3 years. The number itself comes from the man who designed the whole operation. His name is Richard Caldwell, COO. He set this up and he runs it, and when Stokes gets too sloppy, which he is, Caldwell will clean it up himself." He looked at Marcus. "Now you know how far to run." "I appreciate it," Marcus said. "Get in your truck." He got in his truck. He put it in reverse. He backed down the logging road slowly, watching the 3 men in the clearing through the windshield as he backed away, watching them not move until the trees came between them, and he couldn't see them anymore. He reversed all the way to 12A, pulled onto the road, drove 1 mile south. Then he said it, quietly, into the wire against his chest. Richard Caldwell. In a van somewhere behind him, Scott Finley leaned forward. His voice, which Marcus would not hear until later, said, "Got it. We got it." Marcus drove another half-mile. Then he pulled into the parking lot of a gas station and put the truck in park. He sat with both hands on the wheel and let himself shake. Not long, 45 seconds, maybe less. The specific physical release of a body that had been holding something too tightly for too long. Then it was done. Then he was still. He drove back to Montpelier. The conference room was already full when he walked in. Laura at the head of the table. Thomas against the wall, with his arms crossed. But something different about the crossed arms tonight. Something that was satisfaction rather than vigilance. Scott at the far end looking at a tablet. Elizabeth was in the chair she'd sat in the night before, and she was looking at the door. When Marcus came through it, she stood up. "Caldwell," she said. "Richard Caldwell. 3 years running the operation. Sandra Ames handles the accounts. He'll clean up Stokes when Stokes gets too exposed." Marcus sat down. Someone had put coffee in front of his chair. He didn't know when. He picked it up. That's what they said. Elizabeth sat down slowly. She put both hands over her face, not dramatically, just briefly, a small private gesture that lasted 3 seconds and then was done. Then she took her hands away and looked at Laura. "Get legal. Get the federal team. We go Tuesday." "Tuesday is 48 hours, Laura said. "I know." "Caldwell will know the meeting happened by Monday morning. He'll know by Monday afternoon that the records they bought aren't the only copies. He'll start destroying internal documentation by Tuesday at the latest." Elizabeth's voice was even and direct. "If we wait for Wednesday, we lose what's in his office. We move Tuesday." Laura did not argue. She stood up and walked out, already dialing. Elizabeth looked at Marcus across the table, something in her face that he had not seen before or had seen only in pieces separately, and was now seeing assembled. The tiredness was still there, but underneath it something had changed. Something had been set down. "You did it again," she said. "I did it again. How do you feel?" "Like I need another 45 seconds of being parked at a gas station on 12A. A sound escaped her that he had heard once before, the short real laugh, the one that surprised her. It was briefer this time, but it was there. He took the envelope out of his jacket and passed it to Thomas, who had a sealed plastic evidence sleeve ready, which meant he had been expecting it. Marcus watched the envelope disappear into the sleeve. $60,000 going away to become evidence, which was what it had always been. "Marcus." Elizabeth was still looking at him. "Yeah. I need to tell you something about Caldwell." He waited. "He gave me a fountain pen for my 30th birthday. A good one, black with a gold nib. He stood in my office and told me he'd had it engraved and I should use it every day and let it remind me what the company was capable of." She paused. "I have used it every day. It is in my desk drawer in Burlington right now." Another pause. "I will not use it again." The room was quiet for a moment. He was one of my father's hires. He stayed because he was useful, and because he understood how the company worked at a structural level that most people don't. I put him on the internal culture committee. He wrote the company ethics policy that is currently pinned in every break room of every Crestline facility in the Northeast. She stopped. He built a system of theft and then wrote the policy that made it invisible, and I let him. And you are the one who ended up in George Pullman's office with a termination notice. We've been through this accounting. I know. She looked at her hands. "I'm not doing it again. I just wanted to say his name out loud to someone who would understand the full weight of it. Thomas Greer from against the wall cleared his throat, not a comment. Just a sound that said, I'm here and I understand and I'll be here as long as you need. Tuesday morning came with frost on the windshields and a sky so clear it looked like it had been washed overnight. The suit had arrived at Marcus's door Sunday evening, in a garment bag with a note from Elizabeth's assistant that said simply, don't ask, just wear it. It fit correctly in the way that suggested measurement rather than guesswork, and Marcus had no memory of being measured, which meant someone had inferred it from the coat he'd left in a chair in the compliance building one afternoon, and which was, apparently, close enough. He stood in the hallway of the 9th floor of the Crestline corporate building in Burlington and looked at the door at the end of it. Glass D. Caldwell, Chief Operating Officer. The assistant's desk beyond the glass was empty, relieved of duty that morning under a pretext that Laura had arranged the day before. Elizabeth was beside him. She had on a charcoal suit, her hair pinned, the kind of stillness about her that was not calm so much as collected, everything drawn inward and organized, the way water collects before it moves. Laura was 2 steps behind with a leather folio. Thomas and 2 men Marcus didn't know had taken positions at either end of the hallway. The building below them in the lobby held 6 federal agents who had arrived 11 minutes ago and were waiting for a call that had not yet come. Elizabeth walked to Caldwell's door and opened it without knocking. Richard Caldwell was at his desk, on the phone. He looked up with the mild irritation of someone interrupted in the middle of something, and then, 1 second later, the irritation resolved into something more complicated as he understood who he was looking at. He said into the phone, I'll call you back. Hung up, Elizabeth. His voice was composed, the voice of a man who had survived many difficult conversations by treating them as administrative problems. I wasn't expecting you today. I know you weren't. She walked into the room. Marcus walked in behind her. Laura came last and closed the door. Caldwell looked at Marcus. Who is this? Marcus Webb, deputy to the CEO for field operations. Elizabeth's voice was level and clear. He worked the dock at Crestline Grover Falls for 2.5 years, until Kenneth Briggs staged a theft to frame him for your operation. Marcus, Mr. Caldwell. Caldwell looked at Marcus. Marcus looked back at him. 58 years old, silver hair, square jaw, the upright posture of a man who had decided a long time ago that how you held yourself was the first thing people read about you and had worked to make that reading a favorable one. He had the kind of face that probably photographed well. Mr. Caldwell, Marcus said. You don't remember me. I don't recall that we've met. We have. Twice. You shook my hand at a company all-hands in 2022 and at a facility visit the following spring. You checked your watch during the handshake both times. Marcus paused. I noticed. I didn't say anything. People like me don't say things like that to people like you, usually. He paused again. I worked that dock for 2 years and 7 months. I knew every shipment that came through. I knew the weight of a full pallet and the weight of a short one. I knew which Tuesday nights ran heavy and which ran light, and I knew why, even before I had the data to prove it. And I know that the system you built, the reporting structure, the accountability chain, the audit thresholds was designed specifically so that someone like me, noticing something like that, would have no way to make it matter. Caldwell was silent. It was personal, Marcus said. You thought it wasn't because you didn't know my name, but it was personal to my daughter. It was personal to my mother-in-law, who had to step in when I couldn't. It was personal to the people in the hospitals who waited for equipment that was supposed to come. You built a system to make it invisible. You were wrong that it would stay that way. The room held the words. Caldwell looked at Elizabeth. Whatever process is being invoked here, I'd prefer to have counsel present. Your counsel has been notified, Elizabeth said. They're on their way. You'll have time with them after. She walked to the desk. She stood in front of it. Richard, I need you to do one thing before they arrive. You're going to stand up. You're going to open the top left drawer. You're going to give me the pen. A pause. He knew which pen. Of course he knew. He was the one who had given it to her. He stood. He came around from behind the desk. He opened the top left drawer and stood looking at it for a moment. Then he reached in and took out the fountain pen, black, gold nib. The engraving on the barrel, too small to read from where Marcus was standing, and held it for a second. Then he held it out. Elizabeth took it. Thank you, she said. He walked to the door. At the threshold he stopped. He looked at Marcus. The look of a man who had spent a career reading rooms and still in this moment did not entirely know what he was looking at. "Mr. Webb," he said, "you understand that none of this was personal." Marcus had known this was coming. Laura had told him weeks ago that it was coming. That the man would say it because the man believed it. Because the man had built his version of the world on the premise that if you were not personally invested in the harm you caused, the harm was somehow smaller. "That's the thing," Marcus said. "It was personal. It was personal from the minute Briggs put my name on the paperwork. It was personal to everyone who couldn't make rent because they lost a job they'd done right. You just didn't have to experience it as personal. That's the privilege you bought with the system you built." He held Caldwell's gaze. "You were wrong about how long it would last." Caldwell said nothing. He walked out into the reception area. Marcus moved to the door and closed it behind him. Through the frosted glass he could see the blurred shape of Caldwell settling into the reception chair, not pacing, not reaching for his phone, just sitting in the specific stillness of a man who has finally arrived at the moment he spent years believing would not arrive. Marcus turned around. The room was quiet. Laura was already on her phone, murmuring something into it with the focused efficiency she brought to everything. Thomas had moved to a position near the window. Elizabeth was standing in the middle of the office, holding the pen in both hands, looking at the desk that Caldwell had just vacated. Then she looked at Marcus. "You did that well," she said. "I've had practice lately." He paused. "I want to be there. When you fire him officially, when legal comes up, I want to be in the room." "You were in the room, I mean as your deputy, not as the man they framed, as your deputy." She understood the distinction. He could see her understand it. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course." Laura said into her phone, "Send them up." Somewhere below, in a lobby that smelled like climate-controlled air and institutional carpet, 6 federal agents stepped into an elevator. What followed was the kind of legal process that moves at its own pace and cannot be hurried by the people most invested in its outcome. Courts have their own sense of time, and federal courts have an especially pronounced version of it. And Marcus learned this in the weeks that followed the way you learn the weather in a new city, by experiencing it until it stops being surprising. Sandra Ames entered a plea agreement in early December. She gave 3 names in exchange. 2 of those names connected to companies that were not Hartley Freight, and those companies would have their own season of consequences. Kenneth Briggs was arrested on a Wednesday morning at 6:30, still in his recliner, still in the clothes he'd slept in, the television on, the sound low. He did not resist. He looked, the arresting officer said later, like a man who had been waiting for a specific thing to happen, and was mainly just relieved to know finally what the thing was. Brian Stokes was arrested in his corner office. His son at the college in Connecticut found out from a news alert before anyone called him. Elizabeth had quietly arranged through a trust that Hartley Freight's legal team structured carefully to cover the remaining tuition. The boy would not know for 2 years where the money came from. When he eventually figured it out, he would write a letter. Elizabeth would keep it in the same drawer as the fountain pen, which was now in a small wooden box that had belonged to her grandmother, which was the right place for things you needed to keep and couldn't use. Richard Caldwell went to trial in June. He did not plead out. He sat through the proceedings with the composure of a man who had made a calculation about optics and was committed to it. And he was convicted on 11 counts and sentenced to 9 years, and the judge read briefly from Marcus's victim impact statement into the record. Caldwell did not look up during the reading. Marcus was not in the courtroom. He was at a Crestline distribution hub in Syracuse at 6 in the morning, in the break room, drinking bad coffee with a woman who ran the night crew and had 3 specific complaints about the scheduling software that nobody in corporate had ever listened to. He had his notebook open. He was listening. Elizabeth sat alone in the back row of the courtroom in a dark coat with her hands folded in her lap. When the verdict was read, she nodded once, in the way she nodded at things that were resolved. Then she got up and drove back to Burlington. That evening she drove to Grover Falls. Marcus and Nora were at the kitchen table when she knocked. He'd told Nora she was coming, and Nora had set a 3rd place at the table without being asked, which was the most Nora way of doing things, practical and quiet and correct. They ate takeout Thai from the place 2 blocks over, and nobody talked about the verdict or the courtroom. And Nora told a story about a substitute teacher who had eaten a worm on a dare, and Elizabeth laughed at it, really laughed. the kind that came from somewhere unrestricted, and Marcus watched her laugh and thought that this was what it looked like when a person put something down they'd been carrying for a long time. The road tour, Marcus called it privately, 3 months of showing up before dawn at distribution facilities across the Northeast, not as a corporate visitor, not as anyone who required a prepared presentation. Just a man with a company badge and a notebook who sat in break rooms and asked questions and listened to what the answers actually were beneath what the answers officially were. He filled notebooks. He brought them to Elizabeth on Friday afternoons. She read fast and underlined in the margins and asked questions that were always about the person behind the data point, not the data point itself. This supervisor in Scranton, the one you say is good, why hasn't she been promoted? And they would talk about that for an hour, two people with different angles on the same problem finding where the angles met. The work was good. It was the best work he'd done. Not because it was glamorous, it was not, but because it was the kind of work where what he knew mattered, where the specific knowledge accumulated over 2.5 years of doing a job that everyone above him in the corporate structure had considered simple turned out to be the most valuable thing in the room. Elizabeth had been right about that. He had not entirely believed her when she said it. He believed her now. He fixed the banister on the staircase on a Saturday in November. He replaced the cracked kitchen window that had been drafting cold air since September. He bought a new couch. The old one went out to the curb on a Thursday and was gone by afternoon, which was how things left Birch Street, quietly and without ceremony. He bought Nora a proper desk lamp because the one she'd been using was giving her headaches, which she had not told him, but which he had inferred from the way she rubbed her eyes when she studied. He and Nora stayed on Birch Street. They could have moved. He had raised it once, carefully, over cereal one morning, mentioned that there might be options. Nora had looked up from her bowl and said she liked her room, and she liked the corner for the bus, and she liked the way the building smelled on cold mornings when the laundromat was running, which was a thing Marcus had not known she noticed. He said okay. She went back to her cereal. They stayed. Elizabeth came to Birch Street for the first time on a Sunday in February. Not a date. They both understood that, without saying it, the way you understand things that are important enough to leave temporarily unnamed. She came with a binder she needed to review before a Tuesday board meeting, and she called Saturday night to ask if she could come by Sunday afternoon. And Marcus said yes after a pause that was slightly longer than it needed to be, and she heard the pause and didn't comment on it. Nora was at Carol's. Carol had a quilting group on Sundays that Nora had inexplicably begun attending, and the two of them were apparently deep into a project involving a complicated geometric pattern that Marcus had looked at once and decided he respected without needing to understand. Elizabeth arrived at 1:10. She came up the stairs alone, which Thomas had not liked but had agreed to, because Marcus's building had one entrance, and Thomas could cover it from his car on the corner. She had a canvas bag and wore jeans and a sweater and her hair in a braid, and she looked, for the first time Marcus could locate clearly, approximately her own age. She took her boots off at the door before she was asked. She noticed the small rug in the hallway, the one Diane had bought at a yard sale the summer before Nora started kindergarten, braided cotton in faded blue and red, and she stepped around it carefully. "This is nice," she said, looking at the apartment. "It's fine. No, it's nice. It looks like people have actually lived here." He made tea. They sat at the kitchen table with the binder open between them and worked through it. She had a way of reading that was efficient without being dismissive. She understood something the first time through and didn't need to read it again, which meant the 2-hour review they'd planned took 1 hour and 40 minutes. Around 3 o'clock she stood up to stretch. She walked through the living room. She stopped at the bookshelf. The photograph. Diane at Nickel Lake the summer before Nora was born. Hair in her face. Laughing at something that had been genuinely funny, not camera-lawing. The full expression of someone who found the world more amusing than it expected to be found. Elizabeth looked at it for a while. "Tell me about this one," she said. "Nickel Lake. A long weekend. It was about 100 degrees and we forgot the tent poles, so we slept in the truck." She's laughing. She thought it was funny. She thought most things were funny, including things that weren't, which was sometimes annoying and mostly a gift. Elizabeth looked at the photograph for a long time. "I want to tell you something," she said finally. and I don't know how to say it without it becoming something it isn't." He waited. "You are the first person in a long time I don't have to manage how I present myself to." She was still looking at the photograph. "I talk to you about things that aren't work. I notice myself doing it. I don't want to stop." A pause. "I'm not asking for anything. You're my employee, that matters, and I'm not pretending it doesn't. And Diane is in this photograph for as long as you need her to be. I'm not asking you to change that, I just wanted you to know." He stood up. He walked to where she was standing and looked at the photograph with her. Diane at the lake, laughing at the tent pole situation. She would have had something very specific to say about the present circumstances. He knew her well enough to know it would have been funny and affectionate and slightly pointed, in the way her observations always were. "She would have liked you," he said. "You think so?" "She would have teased you. But yes, she would have liked you." "What would she have teased me about?" "The convoy." He paused. "She would have wanted to know if Thomas was allowed to go to the bathroom by himself." Elizabeth made the sound, short, real, the one he'd learned to recognize as hers. "I'm not going to do anything about what I said either," Marcus said. "Not yet, not yet," she repeated, a single word carrying a lot of weight. 2 syllables. Enough. They went back to the binder. She left at 4:30, and at the door she put her hand briefly on his forearm, not a handshake, not an embrace. Just contact. 4 seconds of it, the kind that means more because it doesn't try to mean everything. Then she was down the stairs and on the street, and Thomas pulled the car around from the corner, and Marcus stood in the doorway and watched until the car turned at the end of the block. He stood in the apartment in his socks. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the place where Elizabeth had been standing. He thought about his daughter at a quilting circle 2 blocks away, learning a geometric pattern. He thought about the $40. He thought about the specific logic of a life. How the smallest moments didn't announce themselves as pivots, didn't arrive with any indication of what they were opening. Just sat there looking like ordinary mornings until you looked back from further along. 2 Octobers after the one that had started all of this, they got married. At the bus stop. It had been Elizabeth's idea. She'd said it one evening on the phone, not presenting it as a proposal so much as stating something she'd already thought through, and Marcus had laughed, and then heard the quality of the silence on her end, and stopped laughing. She was serious. He thought about it for about 6 seconds. "Okay," he said. "Yeah, let's do that." The town had put a small plaque on the shelter support post the previous April. Marcus had walked past it on his way to the pharmacy and stopped and stood there with his hand over his mouth for 10 minutes. The plaque said, "Kindness has been known to stop here." No names, no explanation. The town had not told them it was coming. He'd called Elizabeth and she'd gone very quiet and then said, in the voice she used when she was close to crying and was not going to cry, "That is the most Vermont thing I have ever heard in my life." The wedding was small. Actually small, not the way weddings claim to be small. 23 people. Carol Whitfield in a dress she'd made herself, sitting in the front row with Nora, holding hands. Because Nora didn't need to be held, but Carol did. Laura Voss with her reading glasses on the chain, crying quietly and appearing surprised by this. Thomas Greer in a tie that matched nothing present and watching the perimeter out of professional habit, because some things were too deeply wired to turn off. Paul Rourke with his wife, who called him her bear. Scott Finley with his girlfriend, who shook Marcus's hand very seriously and said she'd heard a lot about him. George Pullman came. He'd asked if he could, and he'd been told yes. He stood to the side in a jacket that didn't quite fit him right, and spent most of the ceremony looking at his shoes, because he had asked to come and had been granted that, and understood it, meant something and didn't yet know what to do with the complexity of it. Marcus had forgiven him in the way that you forgive things that were done to you, by people who were themselves in impossible positions, which is a forgiving that has room for the full truth, and doesn't require you to pretend the truth was simpler. The officiant was Iris Doyle, 72, hardware store owner, former justice of the peace, wearing canvas work pants under a good wool coat because she was Iris Doyle and that was who she was. She said what was true and brief. She said 2 people had walked into a hard autumn, one carrying nothing and one carrying too much, and had recognized something in each other in the middle of it. She said she didn't know much about love specifically but knew something about stubbornness, and that in her view a marriage was mostly stubbornness about each other. and the two people in front of her had that quality in a form she found promising. Marcus said, "I didn't know on the worst day of my life that I was going to look back on it as one of the best. I didn't know those two things could be the same day. I know it now. I'm going to try every day to be the man you decided to marry. I'll fail some days. I'll apologize on the ones I fail. I'll do my best on the rest. I love you," Elizabeth said. "You stopped for someone you didn't know at a bus stop that wasn't a bus stop anymore. You gave me everything you had left. I have been financially comfortable my entire adult life, and I have never been as surprised by anything. I'm marrying you because you have not once in 2 years stopped surprising me. I hope I manage to surprise you sometimes too. I love you." Carol cried enough for the people who weren't. Nora did not cry. She stood straight in the pale gold dress she'd chosen herself, and watched her father and Elizabeth say the things you say when you have decided to be permanently present in someone else's life. And then she looked up at the mountains that were visible over the rooftops in their late October colors, going gray and brown at the edges, and she nodded the small, certain nod of a person confirming something they already knew was true. Afterward, they walked 2 blocks to a restaurant with a back room. They ate for a long time. Stories went around the table, some of them true. Laura told one about Elizabeth from 5 years before the rest of them knew her that made everyone laugh in ways they hadn't expected. Thomas told one about a logging road off Route 12A that made the room go very quiet and then loud. George Pullman found Marcus at some point in the evening. He stood with a glass of cider and said, "I'm glad you made it, Marcus, just that." Marcus shook his hand and said he was glad too, and he meant it without qualification or complexity, which was the simplest and truest version of what it was. Nora danced with her father once. She was 19 and too old to stand on his shoes, but she did anyway for about 30 seconds before she decided she'd made her point. At some point late in the evening, Marcus slipped out the back. The restaurant had a small patio with string lights, and he stood under them and looked up at the sky, which was the specific black of October nights in Vermont, deep and clean, with more stars in it than most people who hadn't lived rurally understood was possible. He thought about Diane. He let himself think about her fully, the way you can finally think about someone when enough time has passed that thinking about them feels like honoring something rather than losing it all over again. He thought that she would have made a very specific joke about the SUVs that would have been perfect. He thought that she would have approved of Carol and Nora starting to quilt together on Sunday afternoons. He thought that she had been right about the world running on small, untracked kindnesses, about the logic of doing good things in moments where nothing guaranteed they would come back. He thought about the $40. He thought about the space between knowing what you should do and talking yourself out of it. He had not talked himself out of it. Not because he was certain. He hadn't been certain. Just because the voice that said go home was slightly quieter than the voice that said this is who you are. And he had learned to listen to the quieter one. Most of the time the $40 was just gone. Most of the time the things you did for strangers went unreturned and unseen. He had been lucky. He knew that completely. And he also knew that luck and character were two different things, and that what he had been lucky enough to have recognized in him was something he would have carried, whether or not anyone ever noticed. The back door opened. Elizabeth came out. She had a small glass in one hand. She came to where he was standing and stood beside him and looked up at the same sky. "You're missing the dessert," she said. "I'll be in a minute." She was quiet for a moment. "Marcus." "Yeah, thank you for pulling over." He looked at her. She was looking at the stars. Her face in the string light was the face he'd first seen at a bus stop, at 7 in the morning, tired, specific, more complicated than it looked, and also not that face at all anymore. "You're welcome," he said. "I mean it. I know you mean it." She reached over and took his hand. Not the brief contact from before, not the moment and release. She took it properly, fingers through fingers, and held on. They stood under the string lights on the back patio of a small restaurant in Grover Falls, Vermont, on the 2nd October, after the one that had started everything, and looked at more stars than most people knew were there. Inside, Nora was explaining the worm incident to Thomas Greer in complete seriousness. Thomas was listening with the full professional attention he gave to everything, which was possibly the most respectful response to the worm story that story had ever received. Somewhere on Birch Street, above the laundromat, a light was off that used to be on. They had moved some things. Not everything. A car passed on the road beyond the restaurant, then another. Then the night settled back into its own specific quiet, and Marcus Webb stood in it with his wife's hand in his and let himself believe, without reservation and without the old underlying fear that believing was itself a jinx, that the story he was living was going to be all right. It already was.